So this is just gonna be like a follow-up little review from the previous Son of God type thing, for a number of reasons. I just want to clarify a few things. While we're on the subject. So, for example, well, I kind of wanted to do these kind of reviews for a number of reasons, just to kind of help with that whole thing, I suppose. I mean, well, for example, when I start to read certain things, I want to start like taking notes and whatnot, and all of that would be to basically aid with memorization of the material and hopefully recall and whatnot. So one thing you can do is just read something like front to back and kind of get that, but especially with something like this, I think, and something that I've been interested in for a few months now, but I want to kind of like start taking notes for anything that'll stick out, I guess, whether that be highlighting certain passages or putting like little bookmarks wherever. I think it'll be useful. So hopefully I can get started on some of that soon, and that in general it'll be beneficial. And another thing, though, kind of related, is I'm kind of curious about the format. I mean, what I've been doing basically is I would just record video and upload it straight onto the web, and that's basically for speed in some respects, because I know some people have other processes, and I mean, you could always edit a video, and I realize that there might be some kind of, I guess, awkward pauses here and there where I kind of sort of basically thinking about what to say next, and I'm trying not to forget things that I wanted to mention and bring up, so that would be another reason for taking notes. But if you have any like suggestions or feedback, I would be willing to take the constructive criticism and maybe doing something with that to make the feed more digestible. And I don't know, I've had some people say that it was hard for them to pay attention to the whole thing because of some of the I don't know, spaces in speech, I guess. But so in some ways I would be more willing to take the audience's suggestions in mind. That would be kind of interesting. But yeah. Irrespective of any personal reasons for wanting to present the project in any kind of format, for what that may be worth. If that makes sense. Anyway, so yeah, I just kind of wanted to follow up on the whole thing and maybe continue some stuff that may have been unclear, and hopefully keep it a bit short. But basically this whole thing, I mean, the whole consciousness thing is kind of, for the past few years, has been I guess like associated with hippies and hipsters, and you know, like hippies from like the 60s and whatnot, and some of that movement, which in some ways you could argue against or whatever, but for the most part I think most people have been associating that kind of consciousness movement with that kind of stuff. And for whatever that may be, I mean, that's kind of the direction that the stuff tends to take, and that's also where a fair amount of the criticism might come from, as far as dismissing all of the ideas, or just saying like some of the ideas may be incompatible with science. And I mean, what would that mean, that it's incompatible with science or religion or anything like that? That's not really an answer. It's more of a notion or a statement that could very well have its own implications for like further discussion. In some ways, up until a certain point, at least. But I just kind of bring that up because, as previously mentioned, the work has a foreword by Graham Hancock, who is a noted journalist, archaeologist guy, and you may have heard of him, whatever, but I'm just saying that that's kind of where I got into the whole thing. You know, not necessarily like being a hippie or whatever, but I could easily see how that is associated with all of that. And what had happened is I was in high school, and I had a friend, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say his name or not, but yeah, I don't know, but I guess we were like friends. Some dude named Peter, he showed me this song, and it was a pretty interesting song. I'm not sure if I could say what song it was or whatever, but he showed me the song, and it was like the perfect kind of song that I was searching for at the time. And so I wanted to check more of that out, so I checked out the band, and it was, you know, it was this band called Head PE, which stands for Higher Education Planet Earth. So it's Head PE, And I checked out some of their other songs, but I didn't really like them at first. But this was back during the MySpace era, so like I checked out their MySpace, and I didn't really like some of their other songs. I just liked that one. But I would say like a couple of years later, like a while later, I kind of went back and checked out their stuff, and I was more into it. Like I kind of liked their stuff, but I didn't really like it at first, except for that one song. So yeah, there's some of that, I guess. But what had happened is that I was on their MySpace page, and some of their members had their own pages, and so the bassist for the band, I was checking out his page, and he had a blog up, and so I was just like at home surfing the internet and that kind of stuff. So I checked out his blog, and he had a certain post, and as can probably be glimpsed by their name, they're kind of a political band. Like it's kind of like punk, and some of their messages were kind of political. So this guy was like talking about pyramids and whatnot, and possible ancient civilizations, and some possible omission of certain civilizations which could have some dramatic effects for academia in general. And it all sounded pretty interesting to me. In some ways, I always thought like Egypt was interesting, and pyramids, like the whole idea that no one knew how pyramids were built and all that, and some kind of 9/11 stuff, I guess, to some extent. But basically, he was saying that, and then in the post, he was kind of commenting with some people commented on the blog, and then he was like commenting back, but he then mentioned this book called Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock, and he posted the Amazon link, so I went ahead and clicked on that, and the book sounded interesting, and at the time it was like $13 or something, whatever. And so I asked my mom, at the time I was like, hey mom, could you order this book off Amazon? I didn't have a credit card at the time or whatever. So she was like, sure. And it came in the mail, and I started reading it, and it was really interesting. So, I was like, this Graham Hancock guy is a pretty good author, I guess. Why isn't his stuff taught in school, or why isn't this, on the news or anything like that, to some extent. And so basically through that, I kind of got interested in the whole consciousness type thing scene. And it also kind of reinvigorated my interest in reading in general. I had been like an occasional reader, I guess, or a pretty frequent reader since school and whatnot, and that's kind of a different topic. Can't really go too much into it right now for want of time, etc. But so there was that, and for some years now, where then our family had also been like receiving in the mail like this catalog for discount books. You may have seen it. It was like one of those little catalogs and just had a lot of books in it. And you know, it's like when you get like coupons for grocery stores in the mail or whatever, something like that. I haven't seen it in a few years now. I'm not sure if they still do that, but we would get that, and Mom would pass it around the family. She would say, you know, look through it if you want. If you see anything interesting, just circle it, and then I'll, you know, order it. And we didn't really use it that much. I never did. I think she did. But this one time I was flipping through it, and then there were some, like, this one time there was this like book on the Freemasons that I saw, and I thought it sounded interesting because I heard of the Freemasons, and it was like, oh, you know, no one knows what the Freemasons are, who they were, whatever, or what they do. And so there's this book on Freemasons, so I circled it and, you know, wanted to know more about that. So in a similar vein, this one time that catalog was being passed around and I was looking through it, and yeah, this was around like high school, freshman year, and so that's where I had done some of that kind of reading. Some people would call it like conspiracy theory, whatever, but it's kind of easy to see how that kind of stuff would be put under that category. So, having already obtained Fingerprints of the Gods from Amazon, I was flipping through the catalog, and it was my first time seeing Fingerprints of the Gods in that catalog. So I was like, oh, you know, that's interesting. I wouldn't have expected to see that in there. And then, like in the same category as that was in, because it was like split up between like fiction, autobiography, cooking, and whatnot. There was this book, it was like a green book called 2012 Return of Quetzalcoatl by Daniel Pinchbeck, and I never heard of it, but I read the description and it seemed to cover a lot of interesting grounds, so I circled it. And then I guess it came in the mail eventually, and I read it in 2011. Like 2010 had just come to an end, and then it was like 2011, and I was like, well, before it turns 2012, I should probably read this book called 2012. And so I ended up reading it then, and well, in that one he mentions Graham Hancock once, and like Zachariah Stitchin, whom I had also read at the time. And so after reading that stuff, like, you know, Daniel Pinchbeck, is when I more so became interested in like the question of consciousness and all that. And that is kind of this overall kind of work, and this book kind of goes down a similar path as far as subject matter. And I'll go ahead and say some questions that people and science still kind of wrestle with today. So, just to kind of get into a little bit more of that. Yeah, there were just a few more things I wanted to like cover real quick, I guess. Yeah, few interesting things. So, I think there might be a couple conflicting definitions for consciousness. I mean, and that's to say that one shouldn't necessarily confuse like the word conscious or being conscious of something with the idea of consciousness, because they're kind of different, and that's like where the whole kind of hippie thing in a way comes in. Like some mystics and some like Buddhists who claim to be enlightened, for example, they, on the contrary, recommend and they suggest that drugs merely distort one's consciousness, like rather than expanding it, you know, or rather than them being some kind of shortcut. And through that, they don't recommend use. And there are a few like interesting stories about that and whatnot. Like, there's this one story where an enlightened Buddha took acid and nothing happened because they say he was already enlightened, so like nothing happened as far as that goes. But there's like another story where this other like enlightened Buddha guy took acid and he found it to be overwhelming, and so he had an antidote administered to end the trip, basically. So those are two contrasting experiences and opinions about that. And personally, you know, can't really say that I'm like that much into drugs in and of itself. But having that kind of background in reading that kind of literature would kind of influence some opinions of mine. But I mean, really, and I was kind of surprised to see a lack of it in this book, but I was originally like interested in like dreaming and lucid dreaming and what that might mean for reality, but there are some substances that induce dreamlike experiences or states of mind, including marijuana to some extent, or cannabis. So it can be kind of interesting, but ultimately it's probably a different discussion or kind of off topic. But from what I can tell, Mr. Sams himself was not that much into psychedelics. So they aren't really necessary. Sometimes, or a lot of the time, but it's kind of a different topic. But what does go on here is stuff related to that, of course, like I said, consciousness and whatnot. One example is, if you remember or would recall, the inanimate object perhaps possessing a kind of consciousness. And that is that's kind of illustrated through things happening. For example, say there's like disrespecting objects, like say you're looking for something and then you can't find it, and then all of a sudden you find it or something. Or say like you have something but you don't treat it well, and then it like breaks, and then you're like, oh, I should have shown it more respect. It's kind of hard to say, I guess, in some way. It's more of a philosophical question that it would be kind of hard to say what's going on there exactly, with kind of a similar case with like the plants being aware that some harm is going to be done to them. There would have to be like a lot of examples of that and some heavy scrutiny. Because at that point, you're kind of reaching the point where free will or determinism comes into question. And yeah, of course, that debate has been going on since forever. And once you get there, you're just kind of talking about multiverses in a way. There are examples, but it's hard to say. Yeah. One related thing to that is, say you're planning on going somewhere, and excuse me. Say say you have an option to like leave now or leave in like 10 minutes. So say you leave now and that's what happens, whatever happens, happens. But say you decide to leave in 10 minutes instead of now. And since you left in 10 minutes, like your departure was delayed by 10 minutes, say you run into like a friend that you haven't seen in years, and you're like, oh, hey, fancy meeting you here or whatever. Well, since you had that kind of choice that's like, oh, I was gonna leave like earlier, and if I did, then we probably wouldn't have run into each other. What could this mean, or something like that. And then it's just like, well, I don't know, it's just like random. It doesn't, really mean much because, well, from there, chances are from there, you might just end up going on with your life, and then, like, say, running into that person was, like, useless, and, like, nothing happened or whatever. Nothing has to happen, but, say you have a dream that night, though, and, that person that you ran into would probably influence your dream in some way, as opposed to otherwise. Probably wouldn't have if you didn't run into them, but that's kind of the thing. And they say that a lot of stress is caused by these kinds of decisions. Like, they say the definition of stress itself is that moment where you have to consider something and make a decision. And that's not to confuse the word stress with, like, say, the process used in physics or anything like that, like having some stress applied to an object, or which might be the opposite of tension, as far as physical processes go. But, well, I think that's kind of a topic tackled in here, and overall, the book would be nice to reread to see some of the heavier stuff he mentioned, but as far as time goes, it depends on how fast you could read, I guess, and not just that, but memorize specific stuff and be able to retain it and recall it if necessary. There are some people who, I guess their brains are just different, and it could even result from some accident that they gain the ability to have genius type level of like a genius type level of memory retention. But that's kind of something else, I guess. But while we were on the subject, there is, you know, he claims that like the sun could be alive, almost literally, like it could be an eyeball, and it uses like light and stuff to see stuff. But you know, it's like, oh, what's the sun doing? I mean, depends on how far you want to take that, but again, conventional science does have like its own requirements for what life is. And if you want to call something alive, you know, like for example, it has to like reproduce. And arguably you could say like stars reproduce in some way, but you know. Yeah, I don't know whether that would be like a literal kind of reproduction or not, but there's after a certain point you're kind of bordering on spiritualism, and there is a fair amount of spiritual type stuff that comes along with the whole consciousness thing. And even, you know, like certain drugs, even say like cannabis is known to like increase someone's sense of spirituality. And typically that kind of stuff is not compatible or frowned upon by like, science. But some scientists have been known to be believers of God, or to be, you know, kind of spiritual themselves. So I guess they try not to mix the two or have one's beliefs, personal beliefs, influence their kind of work too much. And it's kind of like politicians forcing whoever they are representing to, you know, like influencing laws, or having certain laws in place that are heavily based upon their religion, where everyone might not be a proponent of that religion. So kind of, you know, it's nice to have a balance of all of that, in other words. But then, moving on, another kind of important point he tries to stress is a kind of hive mind consciousness, which he attaches to mostly like animals and smaller organisms. I mean, say you have like termites building a mound, or you know, something like that. And you know, of course, other animals have been shown to be fairly intelligent, and there are different kinds of, you know, intelligence now. It's not just, you know, I mean, of course, one thing would be better at doing something than some other thing, for example, but from there, I think his main idea is that when these I guess, similar organisms are gathered around, you could say that their consciousness might be added together, to form like a more spiritual kind of intent, so to speak, between them. Which is an idea. I mean, just kind of consider it for a moment. But it would, yeah. I mean, I know it's simple enough to just go ahead and say that a lot of what's going on there is bullshit, mostly because conventional science says so or whatever, but the main point would be to just like appreciate some of that. Or as Mr. Sams would suggest, to stand outside in the sun for a few minutes a day and just kind of meditate with that. And after about a week, then see if it makes you feel any better. And no one really wants to walk around and kill things for no reason. Like, when you step on a snail and kill it, it's usually on accident, not on purpose. Not to perform a feat of maliciousness or anything. Kind of from there, he does make another sort of final point, which ends up being kind of interesting. It is the suggestion that perhaps ancient peoples and cultures were, in a way, more wise than we would kind of give them credit for, or that we would assume, because one, they kind of, some sort of designated the sun as a thing to be worshipped, and they based a lot of their activity off of that in some way. Kind of providing them with, I guess, ideas or states of mind that the modern civilized man would frown upon. And they would have seen it as a necessary thing. I guess once they reached the point to have developed our agriculture as a necessary thing to grow that food, and I'd imagine it would have been pretty important there, but yeah. So I guess there's a fundamental difference if you were to take that serious. Because normally you would just say that there's no way that ancient peoples could be smarter or wiser at that, because nowadays we just have technology and access to stuff, but it's kind of a different thing, and in some ways you could say it's like comparing apples to oranges. But if the average people were dropped in like the wilderness or some type of condition that those ancient peoples had, they would be like pretty uncomfortable, I would imagine, and this is not what they're adapted to. But that wouldn't necessarily mean, I think, that one is smarter than the other. I mean, for example, the amount of time it took for man to figure out and develop the atomic bomb. I mean, you would just have to consider how long a similar act would take in general. I suppose, how long for that type of thing to develop, as opposed to immediately pitting them one against the other, which would be a different kind of contest. But again, it's hard to say. How useful some of that ancient stuff actually was, or how effective. I mean, surely it was effective, but of course most modern people would look at it as kind of silly, I guess. And there may or may not be some use for it today. That's not the same as there being any possible use for it back then. But I guess a more stereotypical image of them would be that they were more humble or peaceful in a way. But yeah. Yeah. So that's definitively been shown. That's one thing, but I, in some ways, would kind of be opposed to that. Like, I wouldn't immediately insert the notion that they were automatically more primitive based off of the time that they lived. There are some interesting proposals, such as you know, some cultures had specific technology that is kind of even tricky for us to figure out nowadays, or just how they figured things out. It was just a different time. Like, a lot of these ancient peoples were more devoted to like astronomy. They spent more time outside and in the darkness. Nowadays there's like a lot of light pollution in most cities, so it's kind of hard to get the same decent view, let alone spend as much time outside in the darkness observing the sky. So they kind of had a lot of things like that memorized. Whereas, I mean, most people today are just distracted with other stuff, or they find other things important and they're kind of focused on that. So it's just kind of different. It's basically maybe some of their practices were bullshit, like sacrificing people to the gods or whatever. Some people did that, but overall, maybe considering the time that they existed, some of the stuff that they had or did was pretty ingenious or inventive. So once again, I think that's a fairly decent book that you might want to add to your collection. Yeah, so I would recommend it. Yeah. All right. Yeah. If you have anything you would like to discuss, just go ahead and leave a comment or something.